Welcome to Hard Software. Today, we meet Wiley Jones, co-founder of DOS, as he bravely confronts the ferocious legacy systems, wielding nothing but their bold anti-ERP ERP approach. The stakes are high, and the terrain is unforgiving.
That looks like that's working.
All right, sorry. So you were talking about how you feel you were carrying the Frodo's ring essentially today.
Yeah. So the days where you're not sure if you're Sam or if you're Frodo, right? Anyway, I have so many funny Lord of the Ring, not like Lord of the Rings like things, but like things adjacent to it that are always entertaining to me. Like my wife's understanding of Lord of the Rings, like the first time we watched it, like her impression of it, just things like that are funny. But anyway, the thing today from the customer call that I was telling you about just a minute ago. Have you ever had those customer calls where they ask you such pointed questions that you almost feel embarrassed and you're just like, oh my God, they're just going so hard on it. And I think it happens a lot of times when you're dealing with very sensitive parts of someone's business that they care a lot about. You probably saw this a lot when you were working, especially the past in Silo.
A lot.
That today we were talking to this company that was much too large for what we can serve, but it was a really good exercise for us and for them. Kind of just like they like to see what's on the market, and for us to just try to talk to some bigger companies. They are a big holding company. They have about $50 billion of asset, like of GMV that they manage of total revenue across their holding.
Oh wow,
it's a huge company. And the guy was basically just like, after I was done presenting, he's like, so I don't really get what it does
after
everything.
Oh,
but the thing was by the end of the call, this was at minute 5, right?
Yeah.
By the end of the call, we kind of won him over in his heart because, he went hard at us, and we were able to defensively explain what was distinct and unique about what we were doing, and that responsible pushback. Yeah, it's like the carrying the ring feeling. You're just kind of like, yeah, you can feel like you're on the call with the customer, and you feel that like weight of the conversation.
I totally agree. I think for us, it was this weird dichotomy where people really, really cared about the table stakes features of an ERP, right? So they were all like, well, how do I get my inventory reports? And how do I get my order screen? And how fast is it? And all these things. And then what really got them were the differentiating features, right? Because until then, you're just basically pitching them their existing product. Right. And you can say it's easier to use or harder to use, and it may be true or it may not be true, but until you actually show them some differentiating features, they're not impressed. And when you do, they're like, oh, okay, I see how this can change the business, right? Because I think a lot of these decision makers, they're like, I get it. The UI is faster. It's better. It's in the cloud. It's not running in the corner of a warehouse in a little rack. But what's in it for me in my business? Does it make me more money? Does it not make me more? You know what I mean? And so
yeah,
I think differentiating features were key. That took us a long time to learn. I feel like we were just playing this catch-up game where they need this feature and they need that feature. I think for you guys, it might be a little bit different because it's way more modular.
Yeah.
So for the most part, you can build your own workflows. You can build your own data scheme and system and ontology. For us, it was fixed.
Yeah.
Which is 99% of ERPs out there.
Right. Was it psychologists, the fixed mindset, growth mindset?
Mm-hmm.
DOS is the growth mindset ERP versus the fixed mindset ERP. It's kind of I don't say that to customers, but I should. That's so funny. Well, maybe if they would be interested in that as the kind of the world model that they take on for kind of how we fit into things. The thing that is hardest to reconcile with them is that they have an expectation about what the form something should take is.
Yeah.
And you said the word ontology. That's exactly what it is. It's the semantics of what a thing is that drives so much of their, lizard brain mindset around, well, that's not my inventory report because that's not what inventory reports are to us. And it's not precisely that thing. And when that happens, we have to always be okay, pump the brakes. You can go in and configure and change this to meet your needs. And they go, oh, but the customization is so dangerous and so hard and so whatever. I'm
yeah.
No. It doesn't require us to rewrite code and publish it and, push it to production
Yeah.
for your instance of DOS. It's something that happens the application layer where you can interact with it and it's legible and understandable. And the cynical point of view is that that's just no code, and we've just like rebranded no code as an ERP. But I do think it is more profound than that, because I think a lot of no code, the whole idea around the no code movement is to put self-service as a, now the power is in the end user's hand. But also the idea of best practices and accomplishing a rigorous data model, as you talked about, are also now in the end user's hand. We bring the combination of both of those things to the forefront for our customers. And that's like getting that point across to them is the entire like act of the judo or the jujitsu of the like sale for us, which is very intense.
Making it tangible.
Yeah.
Almost. I'm just going to get this a little bit closer to you, because I'm noticing that. There you go.
Yeah.
I think that it's funny that you were mentioning no code, because I've been thinking a lot about how telling customers that your application is no code is almost a way to tell them like, hey, my application is easy to use. And I think it's been used recently more in like, you can just set up workflows and you essentially have React Flow style like UI.
Yeah, everyone uses it. We use it.
We're thinking about using it too. Like,
great.
It has enabled a lot of these retool style like workflows. Right. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are like putting that a lot in their marketing without thinking about the personas that they're targeting, when in reality, the like manager of a warehouse is not like, I sure wish my ERP was no code. It's like, well, but like I was never going to code in the first place, What is so I was looking through your background, and you have a background in hardware engineering,
right?
Which I think is very interesting. And I would love to know, from your perspective, did you see something while you were a hardware engineer in regards to ERP just not working as a concept? And is that what give you the impetus to like start DOS, or like what's the origin story?
Yeah, it's definitely like the seed that was planted a long time ago. And the genesis of it, I think, actually goes like a lot further back, which is basically that I grew up, in the Midwest, and my dad was an engineer, but he was a mechanical engineer. It's like, I didn't know what software engineers were, and I thought electrical engineering was like people who like wired your house and stuff. No, I'm not even kidding. I think that's what I thought it was.
Yeah.
I was in college. And I went to school for mechanical engineering because that's what my dad did. I was like, all right, well, I'll just go do that. I like engineering. Or I like physics and math and stuff.
Yeah.
And, he worked on cars, and like he worked in the automotive industry for a supplier of like large automotive, OEMs basically. And he worked on like the high mount stop lamp, like the brake lamp basically of the Ford F-150. He worked on the fog lamps on the Mustang.
Yeah.
And then he worked on the convertible top of the Mitsubishi Lancer. Like those are like the big things that, like, of the parts of things he worked on that like people know. That's what my childhood was like. Oh, you're an engineer, you build physical stuff.
That's incredible.
And so I always thought I was just like going to go do all that. But the whole time growing up, it was like there were grumblings and always things where he'd be like, we're implementing this system and the accountants got the prices all wrong on this, and we lost $2 million on this thing. And it was like, it was still there. And so like there was this thing in the back of my head that like, then when I went out into the real world after school, and I had a small job or a job at a small startup, and I was doing electrical engineering work because during college, I found out I really liked circuits and stuff like that. I quickly realized that like the bulk of my job was like operations and program management. And when you make physical stuff, you spend most of your time, kind of bending the world to your will. You don't really spend it like in the generative design phase of doing something. And I think a good analogy for this too is like, if you're a software engineer, how much of your time is actually spent writing code versus not writing code. And, that changes depending on the type of company you're in and like what the role you're in is. But I found that for the work that I wanted to do for making products, so much of my life and time was spent going line by line through spreadsheets, trying to litigate the state of what happened in the past, what is happening today, and what will happen tomorrow. And that was deeply infuriating to me. And so, basically I'll wrap it up kind of with one anecdote where I kind of got like, system of record pilled, basically, was like, whenever I realized I was like, oh, this is like a completely unsolved problem. I was in China I lived in China for a few years. I was working with a contract manufacturer, and we were making a product. We were in a factory that was making Roombas. They made 1 million Roombas a year. but we were not the Roomba company. That's iRobot.
Yeah.
We were some small, pretty crappy startup, and we were off in the corner on like a small part of their facilities, and we were doing demand planning, which is basically like, we're like, hey, we have this build we need to run, procure and produce a bunch of things so we can make our widget, on this schedule. And we were doing that through our manufacturer. We're like, we need our material report to know like what we need to go and buy to make sure we actually have enough material for the build. Just like if you were building any other physical thing. They're like, oh, the material report doesn't run until Wednesday. And I was like, well, why not? And she's like, it just doesn't run until Wednesdays. And I was like, what? And
It's so arbitrary.
it was so arbitrary, except it wasn't. It was just when the cron job and the system ran. And it turns out that sitting right next to me, also complaining about the same thing, is this like program manager at iRobot. And they're making not like, a small amount of like, stupid little widgets like our company was. They were making millions of Roombas a year. And I was like, this doesn't seem like a problem they should have.
That's incredible. And so in a way, the way that the system works shape the way that the humans work and their expectations, because they're basically saying, no, the minion in the system decides to run it once a week and it's on Wednesdays. And until then, you're screwed.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was like, okay, so how do I know what we need to go do for the spot buy for this thing? Like, well, you'll just find out on Wednesday. I can't go and get it to rerun.
That's incredible.
And it just turns out it's just like some SQL query somewhere in the system that would run. And we figured out what to do so we could go and manually get it to execute. But it's just one of those things where I was like, okay, this isn't a solved problem. Like I thought it was a solved problem.
Yeah.
You go to like airports, right? You walk around and you see all the like enterprise software ads, especially like if you're like in Chicago or Illinois. And so if you're in O'Hare or you go to Detroit or something, you see all these like consulting firm ads and the digital transformation. And you see a bunch of people in like hard hats and vests and like with iPads and like a warehouse. That's all fake. Like none of that's real.
No.
And, and not like categorically, but like I'm saying like, just mostly.
It's also, I think ERPs and let's call it the systems of record in general,
right,
have this weird thing. And I'm noticing it now that we're not in the same space where you can sell the idea of the software and make it extremely beautiful looking in the marketing and the iPads and the hard hats and everything.
Yes.
And for the most part, as a software vendor, you can get away with no one in your customer's like team to ever try the product before they actually commit to implementing, pay for it, and just use it. And that to me is wild because all of the problems appear once it's implemented. Yeah. And this happens every time. And I think the way that a lot of the legacy ERP companies will handle this is, oops, no requirements, professional services arm of the company, please come on over. We'll sign a little new like statement of work, another $50,000 to the bill.
Right.
And that to me is crazy because I feel like for us right now, we're building a developer like infra tool.
Right.
And so our buyers would never pay us until they've actually seen it work and tried it for themselves.
Yeah.
And like, I think it's less important in like flexible systems like you guys, where like you can actually, the whole point is to shape it in the way that your business works and not to shape the business in the way that the software works, if that makes sense.
That's exactly how we pitch the product.
Yeah.
Like when we're talking to our customers in the earliest parts of the discussion, before we're even showing them the product, that's like one of the punchlines I use to really get the message across is our approach really revolves around deeply understanding their business, synthesizing it down to its most critical and core components and rebuilding those components using DOS. And the algebra of that, like if you think about like kind of the product as this, building a bunch of blocks with Tetris pieces or something, we just have to make sure we have the right shapes of Tetris pieces to be able to like actually fit into the right places. If you're missing that like long skinny line, like you won't ever get in that one little corner, right?
Yeah.
But we spent enough time building those Tetris shapes, and I kind of show this to them in that way. I'm like, look, this is a company that's kind of like you guys, but not exactly.
Yeah.
And you see how they do things a little differently. And if we tweak this one thing, it would do that for you, and we can easily tweak that. And it's kind of like just holding the mirror up to them and be like, look, here's your business, kind of, and getting them to think a little bit abstractly, just like a little bit.
Yeah.
How, turning back around to the point that you made, how do you think that these companies actually have like the distribution and the ability to go and sell into these large organizations top down without having buy-in from, that's what has amazed me the most about like the sale of these products.
I think it's their go-to-market machines. I actually respect a lot. Like if you look at Salesforce, for example, right? The product itself is bad, right? Again, I don't want to generalize, but for most intent and purposes, which is a CRM, it's actually a notoriously bad CRM. It's hard to use. It's overkill for 99% of use cases. I think they get away with it with one, momentum, and two, and I've had conversations with CROs where they will say, you're using ADIO or you're using like whatever. No. First thing I'm doing when I join your team is just cutting HubSpot, cutting ADIO. That all is gone. I'm switching to Salesforce because that's what I know.
Right.
But the thing is, they're not the ones using it. The ones using it are the reps who are struggling to use the UI, who hate it. I think it's completely just go to market, and the fact that they've built this marketing around like decision makers. If you notice all of the like marketing for Salesforce or even Oracle or other ERPs, it's all towards the decision makers. They're never going to be targeting the actual user, like running workflows on the system, because they know they suck at. And so I think it's confidence too. I truly think they're confidence machines. Like if you look at their LinkedIn feed, if you look at their Twitter feed, it's just a barrage nonstop. Like, look at us, we are doing something amazing, but there's nothing behind it. And I think it's almost like the reality, like Steve Jobs' reality distortion field. But the difference is that for the most part, that distortion field had some substance to it, and Apple products are like actually really good and people love them. In this case, it's just reality distortion field where like there is just very little behind, and whatever they build, I mean, Salesforce as a core product, they've added a ton of functionality. They've added better APIs, better SD. Has it changed much in the last like 10, 15 years? It has not. It's still...
It's definitely still the same thing. I like 50% agree with what you're saying. I 100% agree 50%.
Okay.
So let me clarify. Have you ever seen the movie Anchorman? He's like, it works 50% of the time.
We were just talking about this.
20% of the time, 100% of the time. I think we have a couple solutions providers we work with whose APIs are like that. I gotta be honest. So anyway, the thing that I find interesting about that is like there's this like there's this duality that exists with large enterprise software companies where it almost feels like the success of the implementation is arbitrary, where some large companies will use them and they'll have a really, really great implementation. And then on the other hand, some large companies you'll hear these horror stories. There's this really impressive horror story at PepsiCo that I've heard. I don't, the exact sources and the validity of it, I'm not totally certain, but this is one I've heard from someone who was a senior VP there. They had a $6 billion implementation of SAP, which is crazy.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that's like almost like indistinguishable from the implementation of like the company, and the actual execution of the company.
Yeah.
So then you have to kind of question. You're like, how can we say that these things are bad when they're like almost like they're so large that they're associated with a very substantial part of like a large company itself? I'm not sure that when you are selling really, really large software like those products, it's almost like they are so interwoven and intertwined within the business that you are selling it to that it's almost like tied in with the success of the company.
I see what you're saying.
So it's almost like there's bad companies and there's good companies. There's people who are incompetent and people who are competent. The thing that makes me think about this is recently there was a thing that went around Twitter. I think it was Oracle sold for $600 million to the state of New York. This, I can't remember what it was called. This like piece of education software, and it like looked like, I don't know. It was like Windows 97. Like it looked like an absolute dumpster fire. Like it just didn't even look like it worked. And it was $600 million that they sold it for. And you could probably UI V0 shad CN and like code gen that thing in like a week. And it'd be much better. And so then it kind of makes you wonder, like, okay, on one hand, like, yes, Oracle is like powering, the production of many facilities for GE and their jet engines. And then on the other hand, like they can't get a, they can't get a school website, right?
It's incredible. It's very similar with like EHRs with like healthcare.
It's exactly
Right? Like the contract. I mean, most of these contracts are public because inevitably they
right.
get some county hospital or like county like health system. We're talking like $500 million contracts up to $1 billion contracts, and I think most of the like cost of implementation goes into the sheer amount of like labor that goes into it and training into like you're just basically forcing the like workers at the company to use this product even though it sucks.
Yeah. Well, and you know the story with Epic, right? Like the EHR company, how they basically like litigate or like regulated themselves into a monopoly. Are you familiar with this?
Well, I'm very familiar with Epic, but I don't know how they regulated themselves into it.
So they have like massive predominant market share.
Yeah.
And there was a thing that happened as a part of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. And this is not like me being precisely 100% accurate, but roughly what happened was as a part of the ACA back in whatever it was in like the early 2000s or early teens, late 2000s, when that all started coming through, they basically were like, we need to get a symposium, consortium of people together, and they really put together some requirements that are going to help us make healthcare better across America. And one of the big things was that they actually forced and mandated that all hospital systems and all like basically care providers have an EHR. I was like, okay, that's reasonable, but how do we come up with the requirements for that? Well, let's bring someone in. Let's bring in people who are really good at this. Let's get Epic to help us come up with the requirements. Well, it turns out that when you ask a software solution provider to come up with requirements for the software solution and set those as the floor, they align that with what their product can do. So they basically made it so there's like, hey, unless you can do the things that Epic can do, you can't be sold.
It's regulatory capture, right? Like
it's the most extreme form.
It's happening with AI. Like it happens with every industry that hits a slight hint of like revenue, I think you're totally right. What do you think is the solution? Like what is the ERP of the future?
I think, okay, there's two answers. There's like me talking my book answer.
Yeah.
And then there's the like a broader, bigger picture.
Yeah.
Me talking my book and like talking about what we do and like broadly systems of record. I think there's kind of like what I would like to see occur is very powerful, abstract, not super opinionated, really great platforms that have extremely good developer ergonomics, the way that like, let's say something we're used to, like that has a really great API, like a Stripe or something like that. And also has a really great, developer extensibility into using your own infrastructure. So that in this example, like let's say we're using DOS to run a bunch of procurement workflows for all of our widgets for our factories. We are running all of our inventory through it and we run all of our order management through it. But we also want to integrate it in with a bunch of stuff that we do with our CRM. We don't want to use it for a CRM. And it turns out that, we have also this massive data warehouse where we're doing a bunch of analytics with customers and all of our advertising and all of our marketing. And we want to use that to project down demand so that then we can go and drive procurement and forecasting. Well, now that looks like not just like a ERP problem, that's like a data platform problem. And they would say, well, who's the vendor that would sell them something that would help them? Okay, maybe they go and buy, and start using a data warehouse, and they have a team of data engineers, and they want to plug those things in natively into DOS or whatever ERP they're using. At that point, the product ends up looking like pretty indistinguishable from developer infrastructure. And that's where I think the real opportunity is that we can make a very safe assumption that developer extensibility is going to be the most important thing in all of enterprise software over the next 10, 20 years. Not because when I say developer extensibility, I mean the ability to plug it into code natively, because everyone's going to get better at coding because AI is really good at coding. And I think when we talk about AI being this, step function change in productivity, I think what it does is it's just raising the floor on the capabilities that every single end business user has. It's obviously increasing leverage for sure for software engineers, but raising the floor for every end business user allows them to say, I don't need to know how to write SQL. I don't need to know how to do these things. I can just talk to this thing in English, and it's going to go and use these AI native primitives to plug directly into the extensible parts of our platform, which are like, okay, like for example, in DOS, we designed it so that it's really easy for us to go plug directly into our data model and go in and make changes.
Yeah.
Versus like, I don't know, like we don't have to redeploy the entire application to go do that. it ends up looking like a system that's got version control and migrations and like things that developers are used to so that they can easily interact with it through code primitives, which is really good for LLMs to interact with it.
Yep.
Which means business users will be good with interacting with it. That's what it distills down to in my mind.
I think that makes total sense. And I think that we have the same thesis from the building blocks side of things, right? Because our entire job as a company is, okay, we want to be the ambient computing platform for future applications. What that means is I don't want to see anyone's users typing things manually into a system. How do we make software that speaks the language of the user? That means they receive a PDF or a fax. They just connect it via these primitives that you're describing into the software, right? And I think that makes total sense. I think it's really funny when you look at movies and you look at how software is depicted in movies. For the most part, the people writing these scripts are not engineers. And so they're depicting this idealistic way of how software should be. You look at, for example, what is the name of that, like the Iron Man, like AI, like Jarvis?
Jarvis, yeah.
So you have Jarvis.
I always think of Minority Report. That's the one.
Or Minority Report, the guy. Well, I love the little like wooden ball that just like shows you the name of the person. It is true, right? And like you think about it and you're like, okay, why is software not behaving this way? It was not built to speak the language of anyone other than like the developer built it. And so I think, to be fair, until fairly recently, until like 2 years ago, I think we didn't have the right tools to actually build these systems correctly because, right? Because we had no transformer models, no large language models, no vision models. We had some primitive AI. I would call it primitive machine learning that for the most part you could train into doing some stuff, but it was getting you, let's say, 80% of the way there, but it still required a lot of manual input. So I'm really excited that finally we're like, okay, cool. Like now we can build a truly, let's call it magical system, like in the movies.
Yeah. You know, I have spent so much time thinking about this because we get asked this question a lot, like people hiring, or you talk to investors, or you talk to customers, or basically anyone. They're like, why is this thing different? Like, why now? Why is this different? And I think, we started the company about 2 years ago. It was actually 2 years and like 5 days as of when we're recording.
Whoa.
Yes, it's pretty funny.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, happy belated. And when I started the company, there was like this moment that made me want to go quit my job, which was that I had been doing hardware engineering and I saw someone write a SQL query in plain English and put it into GPT-2. And this was like, it was like 2022. And when this is before ChatGPT, before GPT-3. And I saw that and I was like, oh, this is it. I was like, it's happening. It's gonna work finally. And I think the thing you're describing, we have a name for, and I refer to it as the semantic transpiler.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's basically, we've had each piece of that for a while, which is like, we could do semantic reasoning, kind of. We could do translation. Like Google had done, obviously, a phenomenal job prior to LLMs. Google Translate was really good still.
Oh, it was so good.
We obviously have very good compilers. We just had not put them together, and you couldn't put them together for a lot of reasons. And basically, self-attention solved those. Like, like one equation, right? Yeah, the equations that will rule the world. There, people joke about it's like, oh, compound interest and Black-Scholes and like, like all kind of stuff, like all those, interesting, important equations, like the Boltzmann constant equations or whatever. The attention of the transformer is like fundamentally taking this complexity that the real world has, and it's capturing it, and it's allowing us to take semantics and transpile them down into compilable primitives.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's just like a fundamentally new concept for compute, for anything. Like we've never had that before.
Yeah, it's a new set of building blocks. And I think for the first time, you can actually expose some of these building blocks to your customers, right? Because like a few years back, it would have been almost impossible to go to a warehouse manager or a business owner and tell them, hey, you can customize this ERP we built you, but you got to learn Python for that, or you got to,
Yeah, and it's gonna extend even further because it's not just about like the code primitives, but it's the ergonomics too. I don't know about you, but like when we talk to some of our end users, like getting them to share a screen can be hard sometimes,
Oh, yes.
right? And you're like, okay, like how are you doing this other really hard thing for your job? It's like, oh, because I spend a lot of time learning and practicing and building tacit knowledge to understand how this workflow works. It's like, okay, I think actually Ramp showed a video of this recently. That's the same thing. What if you had it's a very simple chat interface where you say, hey, how do I go and do this? I need to go and do this thing. And a little cursor pops up and it's Clippy 2.0. It's the Clippy, the revenge of Clippy, right? And he bounces around the screen and goes, here, over here. This is how you fill out the purchase order. And well, you don't need to do that, actually. What you can do is you can go over here and just tell me what you want and I'll fill it out, right? Like that's where we're going. And it's this, I don't know why. I think there's so many big opportunities in that area that I see a lot of companies that are getting work done right now. And I'm just like, can we be more creative about what we're going to go do with all this?
Yeah.
There's so much.
Yeah.
There's so much to go work on.
And I think that, I mean, you could even take that further into Clippy 3.0 Revenge of the Sith and like create the purchase order for the user rather than telling them how to.
Precisely. Yeah.
That is super interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where you guys are at, right? Like you can go further and further into this with less context, with, just reading more into the semantics, reading more into extent existing stuff, right? Like some of the businesses we migrate over, they have decades of data. Okay, do we need to know exactly like how this thing works, or can you just kind of describe it and it'll mostly be correct because we have so much prior data to look back at to reference?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, okay, we can go look at that. Like that actually would materially make an impact in how quickly we can understand the totality of their business.
And so I think that makes total sense. And I keep thinking about the concept of anti-ERP.
Yeah,
I'm
wearing my
you're repping some ERP club.
ERP, yeah. We've had a couple people say that to us. They're like ERP, and I'm like, yeah, okay.
I actually like it a lot. I think it makes it even more interesting.
It makes it more anti, for sure.
It's more counterculture.
It is. Yeah.
What is the anti-ERP ERP as a concept?
As a concept, it's so there's two things about it that are like, it's funny, obviously, because I've said this a couple of times to people. It's funny because there's a semblance of truth inside of it. Like, in order for something to be humorous, it has to be true and untrue at the same time.
Yes.
Right. That's like the beauty of comedy. And, it's us, it's our way of comedically saying, like, look, we believe in the idea of the system of record, but its current manifestation, we think, is fundamentally misaligned and not. Basically, what it ends up looking like is a composable system of record where it's basically just a database with really great validation and great business logic that maps to the real world business processes you have. It's very dynamic for when in the moments you need it to be dynamic. It's static when you need it to be rigid and structurally hard. And you don't want it to be dynamic when you're trying to go and move a lot of money from your foreign exchange account. You want it to function the way it's supposed to function, right? I think the anti-ERP ERP concept is actually like, it's in the name itself, it contains the duality of what is hard about systems of record, which is that they need to be very composable because every business is so unique, but they also need to be very rigid and structural because you don't want these things doing things incorrectly. They're very important pieces of information being stored in them, moved to them, people's payroll, people's benefits. Yeah. I mean, God knows how much money. You have to have both. And so like, I think that's where we are always focused on how do we build something that contains the best parts of being a system of record while shedding and moving away from the things that make them bad. It's just a really fundamentally hard problem, but it's kind of a good ethos for us to always, it's kind of a good like vision board for us at all times.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if at that point, it's not even an ERP anymore. It's something, I mean, ERP is a made up acronym, right? Like everything it's
a non-acronym.
Yeah.
I call it a non-acronym.
It's Enterprise Resource
Planning. Yeah.
Which hilarious.
It doesn't mean anything. I say this to our customers. I'm like enterprise resource planning. Like that doesn't mean anything. None of those mean anything except for enterprise. That's definitely true. It's definitely enterprise, right?
Yeah.
Like other than that, it doesn't mean anything. when I try to capture it for people, I would usually say, we manage the flow of goods into and out of business, into and out of a business, the flow of dollars into and out of a business, and then the data artifacts that kind of get thrown off, and we collect them all up for people and put it into one system of record.
I think that's beautiful. I use that analogy with our customers like years ago at Silo all the time, where I was trying to explain to them, like, look, there's flow of goods and flow of funds, and that's it. And everything, all the workflows, all of the data is just trying to capture what is right now. And for us, food, I mean, it was basically like 100% of the food should always flow downstream. And you always had like,
interesting,
right? So, because like they all this food was completely perishable. We weren't doing any CPG.
Right.
It was all raw inputs, completely, for the most part, unbranded.
Right.
Tomatoes are tomatoes.
Right.
And so the goal was always like 0% waste. And so you want all of the goods to flow downstream to someone. You want to get rid of that as soon as possible. And then the flow of funds was really complicated for us, at least. And I'm sure you've seen this with like distributors, where it was like out of 100% of the revenue, 90% goes upstream. And 10% stays with you. But that also meant that the flow of funds was like weirdly complicated, because all they have is vendors, and everything is vendors for everything. And so, no, I think you're totally right. And I think that I think one thing that stuck with me is that you're saying it should be flexible when it needs to be flexible, and it should be, I don't know if the word is rigid or well structured when it needs to be well structured. Like you were saying,
it needs to be it needs to be predictable, deterministic, exactly. Right?
Is that a difference between, I know probably your users are not thinking about it in these terms, and I'm almost using engineering terms, but I wonder, it's like build time flexibility, but runtime predictability.
Yeah, I mean, we actually have to deal with that exact thing a lot, down to like the nuts and bolts of how we implement a lot of things in our workflows product. So inside of our product, we have this like, Zapier style workflow editor that we built. And you need to build all these guarantees in so that you don't accidentally do things that don't make sense. And the examples here are, let's say we have a form that someone fills out, and it turns out this form is customizable, and you can put whatever you want in the form. You can put a bunch of addresses and people's names and customer data and inventory data, price data, whatever it is. And then they submit that, and that runs through a workflow, and it gets submitted into a table. And the table has a bunch of different types. And, it turns out that someone in that form that they're filling in, they change the type of, let's say, one of the shipping addresses or something. And now it's like, we're actually going to, this field is now going to be used for which shipper we use. Because we don't care what address we're sending to. We just need to pick the shipper, and they'll pick it up and send it to us from us or whatever. Now we've changed the types. And like, again, the ontology of the data model has changed. And the table doesn't know this. The table's like, I'm just over here expecting an address on the other side. And the workflow is like, it needs to recognize, hey, there's this thing that just got fundamentally changed. I need to traverse the entire system and make sure that when I just created this change, that when something will now happen in the future at runtime, that I can handle it properly. And we built an entire system to go and solve all this. We call it Triumvirate, which is kind of funny.
Whoa. It's a pretty cool name.
It's a cool name. It's just like there were 3 Roman leaders. They all kind of were checks and balances for one another, because we have like forms and tables and workflows that kind of like, anyway, just dumb nerd stuff. But the funny thing about it was like, we're like, this is just like an infinitely more complicated thing than we realized, because we could just let our users deal with all the problems, or we have to make it work perfectly, because something in the middle is going to be really scary, where they think it's working and they think it's helping them, and it's not. And so, that was but it's precisely what you described, which is like, they want that runtime. They want the runtime guarantee, and we want the creation time guarantee on our side, because we want to know that once it's set up correctly, we can just be like, all right, we'll forget about it. And then when they're using it, like, they don't want something to break and be like, why did this thing break? Now I have to go debug something. You don't want to debug a piece of software you just bought, right? So that's what's interesting. I think is that ethos makes its way down into the implementation of the product.
Yeah. Have you guys run into any? I mean, I think at the end of it, and I think for most people listening to the podcast, I wonder how many people have actually seen an ERP or been at a warehouse or been at a company that is using an ERP. One of the pieces of feedback we got when we started Silo and we started pushing these beautiful round buttons and UIs was, you guys have no idea how a warehouse actually works. And I am on my feet 12 hours a day. And I need this thing to just be way, way bigger buttons. Stop it with the round border radius, 15 pixels, and just make it. And I kept going back to the same user. And I would be like, what do you think about this? He's like, make the button bigger. And I need all the buttons need to be blue. Blue is action. Everything else is view.
Yeah.
And so we just kept making the button bigger and bigger and bigger. And I wonder if you guys have run into any issues where like different types of users, because I mean, this is a real-time business where a lot of things are happening.
It's not precisely the same, but it's in the same, the same family for sure. It just, you have to be really careful about when you introduce patterns, that you actually adhere to the pattern and that the pattern has like a sensible rationale instead of just being like, yo, this is what all the cool designers are doing on Twitter these days. Like, let's just, like 12 pixel radius. Like, I think the optimal radius for business software is 0.
Yes.
It is.
It's just a button.
Square, like monitors are square. Until monitors are not square, the optimal radius is 0 because you have the ability to create density without radius. And the ability to create density allows these exact, it allows you to take the information architecture and structure it around precisely what's occurring versus what you can fit on the page. And I think the best examples of this are in like really, really hard to use design tools. Like if you look at like Photoshop or Figma, or you go and look at like, I was an electrical engineer, Altium, or you go and look at like any of the CAD tools used to design mechanical parts. The sophistication and complexity of the information architecture of those products is unlike anything else. There's nothing else like it in the entire world. And they're all the exact same. It's because you have to pack in so much functionality. And ERPs are the same way.
You need density.
It's a pro tool.
Yeah. And I think we actually, it's funny, not coming from a background in ERP or even enterprise software, when we started Silo, I realized very quickly, I think one of our very first screens was like our order management screen. Mm-hmm. And one of our users was like, why do I need to click 5 times to see that this order even exists? Because we had built it in a non-pro way where you had all these facets and you got loop, and then you get another screen and then a little breadcrumb and then another one and then another one. And you would just traverse the data hierarchy throughout different screens. The user is like, I just need a Swiss Army knife where I can see everything. And it's almost like a Bloomberg terminal, right? It's like, just blow it up and let me do whatever. And that has its downsides.
It has problems for sure.
Yeah.
It's funny you said the Bloomberg terminal thing. I think that's like one of the best design products ever. Like our product designer, when we were actually building we built our own internal BI product, which is, we call it Data Studio, and it like sits on top of all of our data. And so then our customers, when they want to build reports, they're not like plugging DOS into Looker or plugging it into Power BI. They just use the BI that's built in. And when we were doing all this, it was like the same thing. Every time she brings me designs, and they're really good, I'm always just like, no radii, drop this, square.
That's so...
And I sent her a picture of the Bloomberg terminal. I'm like, I want it to feel like a Bloomberg terminal.
It feels like you're looking into the matrix.
Yeah.
It's just data and its workflows and its purest expression. And you sacrifice a little bit of aesthetics, but as long as you keep the like function, it's the most functional way of thinking about UX.
Yes. I think that function is the most pure aesthetics.
Yeah.
The other thing too that I think you guys probably saw at Silo, and something I would encourage anyone who's listening to this who's even remotely interested in these things as they're hearing them, is to go look at YouTube videos, webinars, or like tutorials on how to use these products.
Oh, wow.
It's a master class in information architecture, because it teaches you what complex end business users truly want in order to solve problems. And a lot of them like hate these products because they're really complex, really hard to use, but they're really complex and really hard to use because they're doing so much complex stuff. And NetSuite's a great example, like the ribbon bar at the top where it's like kind of got all the drop downs and stuff. I think I went through and counted, and it was like there were 200 unique paths out of the home screen just from the ribbon bar.
That's incredible. Yeah. And
That's insane.
because it's so much complexity, all these different workflows. It is a scale problem as well, right?
Yeah.
It's similar to Epic. Like if you look at
Yes.
how Epic works, my wife is a doctor and she complains all the time that there is like 20, 25 different ways of doing the same thing. But it's also like highly relational system. So you need a way to access all of these different resources from everywhere in the graph. What is the future? I mean, you yourself working directly in building an ERP. What do you think what are the trends looking like for systems of record, and what does the future look like? Like, what are the patterns that you're seeing in terms of, not just in terms of design, but also in terms of distribution, go to market? I'll give you an example. I've seen how you guys do go to market, at least from an external perspective.
Yeah.
It's very different from what an ERP would do, let's say, even 5 years ago.
We are definitely having to do things differently in order to like even be viable as an option, because there's this thing that we were talking about this actually, I think before we started recording, around how the portfolio of offerings of a product when you build these tools is so large. You have to build so much stuff that is table stakes that they come to and go, well, we need these 30 things. And if you don't even have 5 of those, then we're out, completely done. And I'm like, all right, well, that's not going to happen. So what do you have to do to make that even possible? So, our answer, and a lot of companies' answers now, is you build this entirely composable primitive space system. And when a company comes to you and says, well, can you do X, Y, and Z? You go, well, do you have an API that we can access for that we can sync data out of? Then yes, we have an integration for that.
Yeah.
It's like, by the time that you need it to be up and running, we'll have the integration done. And also they're like, oh, how does this bid management system work for you guys? Or how does payroll integration work for you guys? And we walk them through the workflows product, and then it just makes sense because it's just, we can model it around what they do. I think there's a couple other companies that are doing this. Odoo is a great example. Odoo is a great company, and they're doing really, really well. Lightweight ERP, open source like software platform. They have a whole installation partner network that goes in and customizes this. I think there's tons of problems with doing that and the way they handle it, and just broadly the quality of the solution. But that's directionally, it's like that was like completely right. They're also like a 20-year-old company. They've been doing this a long time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they've been at it a while too. But I think that's broadly like, when you talk about like what's next, I think the answer to what's next is always like, well, like, let's talk about what happened and then like figure out actually where we're going.
Yeah.
Like what actually happened kind of thing. SAP started in like 1973.
That's incredible.
Yeah. They had their 52nd anniversary last year or this year, whatever. Their 51st anniversary. And there's a bunch of companies that are now realizing that, or not companies, there's a bunch of research firms and, basically, I would say analysts on Wall Street and stuff that are realizing that they're calling it an ERP super cycle is about to occur. It's basically that there are so many like stratified layers of legacy implementations that are unable to be ripped out. And now people are really trying to evaluate how we get them out of these systems or out of these, businesses, because it's preventing us from actually applying automation where it's needed. So like you look at physical automation being the first kind of wave, because we have so much wage growth in the physical sectors, where now you go to every fast food restaurant or you go to grocery stores and they're implementing physical technology, machines, robotics, physical scanners, whatever it is, to be able to go and do things self-service. Well, like what is the self-service version of this in the software world, enterprise software world? Basically, you have I would say some technology partner like an Accenture type. They go in and they implement SAP for you. TCO, total cost of ownership of this, you're looking at like 50 to 80% of it being services.
Yep, exactly.
And so let's just assume that keeps going up, right? Because the technology piece of it's deflationary and the wages of the actual implementation is inflationary.
Yeah.
So over time, that's going to get more and more expensive. And the problem is that the old implementations of these, the wages just keep going up. The software is basically like, completely free at this point. Like it costs zero.
Yeah.
But they can't implement anything to, they can't put any automation in to make the wages go down. And so they're like, we need to go and rip out this like old 1980s or 90s on-prem system in order to go and actually put automation in the rest of our business. And people are finally reevaluating it because wages have just gone up so much. They're basically, they've blocked themselves out from using AI is like the short way of saying it.
I actually hadn't thought about it from even a labor perspective, but that is so true. I will say though, we've felt this directly. I think the number one thing preventing. So as we go up market and we've talked to some enterprise like prospects, the number one thing preventing them from adopting AI is their existing stack.
Yeah.
And this like entrenched, a lot of these pieces in their stack, they're so entrenched and so essential, but so old. No one wants to touch them. No one wants to like deal with that. And they're like, well, this is too complicated. And it's really going to take, basically what these companies are going to need is someone who is very brave, who's willing to risk their job internally to say, no, it's not acceptable to have this tool anymore because it's actually preventing us from moving forward. But I think it's going to take bravery. I think it's a more human problem than like a software problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it is. I like to look at anything that happened that's like similar in the past as the answer here.
Yeah.
And if you look at how computers were adopted in enterprise and commercially, I would say, a lot of the same idea of like doing rip and replace of the mainframe systems that got actually installed.
Yeah.
They were also worried about the same thing when they were moving over onto computers, as what they are worried about what they're worried about today, where they're like, okay, we have this way of doing things, the pen and paper and our bookkeeping and accounting and the ways that we run our business. And you want me to put this on a machine and I have to go and transcribe all this stuff. We have to go and take all of our historical records and move them over. And like, I don't know. Right? There was the same amount of hand wringing. And, I think the big difference, honestly, is that you could just see it all. And like now it's this like abstract black box thing. Like truly, sometimes it's a black box. We have a customer where we're moving their system off of an AS400.
We have a customer that we're now onboarding with an AS400.
Oh, that's good. Because that's awesome. But that's the thing is it's a literal black box.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I think that's, if we look at the past kind of to tell the future, I think it's a wage story. It's a story about, fighting growing wages and bringing automation into places where it needs to be brought in. And the businesses that are feeling the most pain, that's why they're interested in this.
Yeah. And we've so as we've talked to more enterprise people, I think there's this broader point that all of them see the writing on the wall that they need to change the way they do things because the way things worked 30, 40, 50 years ago has changed. And I think wages are actually a huge part of this. I had not thought about it this way, but I think that especially a lot of real life industries, let's call it like healthcare, supply chain, they see that, I mean, they're margin thin companies. And I think they're realizing like, these margins are becoming thinner and thinner every year. And the way to solve this is with better software.
Yeah.
But for that, they're going to have to basically just destroy a lot of what they have internally.
Yes.
It's going to take some people with bravery. And I feel like when we speak to some prospects, the ones that are more likely to engage with us are people internally that are a little brave. And they're like, okay.
I mean, I see the exact same thing. I've referred to it in a different way, but brave is a new one for me. And I'm going to have to think about that more because that feels right. What I describe it as, actually, people talk about like finding your champion, go to market, right? And like on the distribution side, finding your champion. When you're in any deal, my immediate thing, like I'm a heat-seeking missile, straight to the most competent person in an organization. That is the only thing I care about. I'm just going to go and find I don't even care how related or adjacent they are to like what we're doing.
Yeah.
I just go and look for the most competent person in the side of a company or like roughly like where we're operating. Because once you find them, they will help you unlock any problem you have. And when you find them, and you have to get them bought into the idea.
You gotta evangelize them.
Yeah. But yeah, if this is maybe a mean way of saying it, but like if your evangelist is like not someone that anyone respects because they're not competent or like, lack of a better word, they're an idiot. Like, yeah, don't do that. You need to go make sure you evangelize the person who has the big hammer that can swing in the organization. Not just from like a decision-making power, like top down, but like someone who's a change agent, and that comes from competence. But yeah, you have to, it's a two-way street. You have to deliver that to them too.
No, totally. They got to buy in and they got to believe in what you're trying to do and the change. This was awesome. Thank you so much, Wiley. I feel like
Fun.
We meet all the time,
Yeah.
and we're both part of the Anti-ERP ERP club.
ERP.
And we were just so excited to do this because I feel like DOS and BAM share so much of the philosophy behind of what we do and the incentive to build what we build. So thank you so much for this.
Of course, man. This is great. I appreciate you coming out.